It was a cool, quiet evening when I first began to hear the sounds that would change everything. It wasn't a particularly eerie night, no storm brewing, no strange winds sweeping through the trees. The temperature had dropped just enough to make the air crisp, but the sky was clear, the stars faintly glimmering in their usual places. The house was still, too. The low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath me were the only sounds breaking the silence. I had just settled into my routine, nothing unusual about the evening, when a soft tapping sound reached my ears, as faint as the wind against a window. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, as old houses tend to do. But when it came again, that unmistakable tap, 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 it felt like something deliberate, something that didn't belong. I tried to push the thought aside, but the sound didn't stop. It became more defined, and slowly the pattern started to take shape. A rhythmic thud, almost as if someone was walking across the roof, their steps muffled by the shingles but still enough to make me pause. I stood there listening, wondering if it could be anything else, a stray animal maybe. Yet the sound seemed too methodical, too persistent to be just that. The longer I listened, the more I realized the rhythm was growing, as if someone was packing just above my head. It wasn't the wind or the house. No, this was something else. As the night grew deeper, the silence in the house became even more profound, almost suffocating. The noise from above continued, slow, deliberate steps that seemed to echo down through the walls. And as I lay there, waiting for the morning to break, I couldn't help but wonder, what could possibly be walking above me at this hour? And more importantly, why couldn't I shake the feeling that it wasn't alone? It started on an ordinary night. The kind where everything feels like it's supposed to, the soft hum of the fridge, the creak of the old house as the temperature dropped, and the gentle rustle of trees outside my window. I was alone, sitting on the couch, the only light in the room coming from the soft glow of my lamp beside me. The evening had been uneventful, just me unwinding after a long day of work. I could hear the clock ticking steadily on the wall, the comforting rhythm of time passing by. The air had that crisp, almost empty feeling to it that only the late hours can bring. You know, the kind when everything seems a little too still, but you don't think much of it because it's quiet in the way that is supposed to be comforting. I had settled in with a book, my favorite spot on the couch, a cup of tea by my side. I was just getting lost in the pages when the first sound came. At first, it was so subtle I almost dismissed it. It was a faint creak, the kind of noise an old house makes when the wind shifts or when the temperature drops suddenly. I wasn't alarmed, it wasn't anything new. Houses make noises, especially old ones like this one. I paused, listening for a moment, but it wasn't repeated. As I went back to my book, the house, for the most part, remained quiet after that, but then it came again. A soft creak, this time louder and more deliberate, like someone had just shifted their weight on the floor above me. I raised my head, my focus slipping from the pages, the strange sensation of being watched creeping over me. I glanced toward the ceiling, trying to place the noise. It was too distinct to be the house settling, I thought. It wasn't random. It was too purposeful. For a moment, I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a shift in the house's foundation, perhaps. I'd heard creaks like this before, but this felt different. I stood up, walking through the hallway, listening closely. But the sound didn't come again. The house was quiet. I reached the stairs that led up to the second floor, the familiar wooden steps creaking under my weight. Nothing felt amiss. The rooms were all empty, the door to the attic closed as it always was. Still, the air felt dense, as if something had shifted in it while I was reading. I didn't know why, but I suddenly felt as though the silence was watching me, like it was waiting for me to notice something. I turned off the lights in the hallway and returned to the living room, sitting back down. My book was still open on the couch and the room was still. That was the unsettling part. It wasn't the creak itself. It was the way the air felt afterward, too still, too heavy, like something was waiting for me to react. It was the kind of feeling you get when you know something's there but can't quite place it. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but then it happened again. This time it wasn't a creak. It was a soft, slow drag across the floor above me, like something or someone was walking around up there. The sound was subtle at first, but it was unmistakable. It wasn't the house. It wasn't the wind. It was too distinct, too measured. My heart rate picked up, a small pulse of adrenaline seeping in. I stayed still for a moment, listening. The sound continued, a slow, deliberate movement that circled the upper floor of my house. I had no idea who it could be. I lived alone. The hairs on my neck stood up as I realized that whatever it wasn't just moving randomly. It was methodical. I grabbed my phone, briefly considering calling someone, but I couldn't shake the feeling of embarrassment. I didn't want to seem paranoid. There was no real evidence that anyone was in the house. The doors were locked. I had checked. Still, my mind kept racing. What if it was a burglar? What if someone had broken in? The thought was irrational, but the longer I listened, the more it gnawed at me. The slow footsteps continued, packing the length of the upstairs hallway. Every so often, they would stop. It was as though the presence above me was listening, waiting for something. I stood up again, more cautiously this time. The floorboards creaked softly beneath my weight as I tiptoed toward the stairs. Each step felt heavier than the last, and the silence between the creaks made it seem like the house itself was holding its breath. I reached the bottom of the stairs and stood there, my hand gripping the railing, just listening. The dragging sound had stopped. In its place, I could hear the faintest shuffle, like someone was adjusting their position in the room above me. I took a step up, my heart hammering. Another step. The air was cold now, the temperature having dropped further, as though the house had exhaled and let in something colder. The floorboards creaked beneath me again, and I froze, holding my breath, but there was no response from above. The silence stretched longer this time. I took another step, then another, until I was halfway up the stairs, but still there was nothing, no footsteps, no sound. And then, just as I was about to reach the top, the light from the hallway flickered. The sudden movement of light startled me, and I stumbled backward, almost falling down the stairs. My heart skipped a beat. I looked up. The hallway at the top of the stairs was empty. There was no one there. The air remained still. No footsteps, no shuffling, just quiet. I stayed at the top of the stairs for a while, trying to calm myself. The house remained silent. I checked every room, the attic included, but found nothing. There was no one in the house, no one to explain the sound of walking. The house was exactly as I had left it. That night I locked the doors, turned off the lights, and climbed into bed. But even as I lay there, I could still feel it, the weight of the air, the presence that wasn't there but was somehow still watching. I've never quite been able to shake the feeling that something or someone was in the house that night. A visitor I couldn't see, or maybe I didn't want to. And even now, when I'm alone in the house, I still listen for the faintest sound, the soft creak of a footstep on the floor above me. It's because I'm not sure if I'll ever truly be alone again. It was the kind of night that was supposed to be peaceful, the kind that invites you to sink into your bed with a good book or a cup of tea, the air cool enough to make you pull the covers up just a little higher. I had moved into my apartment a few weeks earlier, a small two-bedroom unit in an old building that was supposed to be charming. The floors creaked underfoot, the radiators hissed when the heat kicked in, and the hallways had that peculiar stillness you only get in buildings with long histories. There was something about that quiet that felt like a comfort, a reassuring hum of familiarity, like a song you'd heard 1,000 times and could almost hum along to without thinking. I liked it. I liked how the world outside faded away when I closed my door. The building felt like mine. The first few nights were uneventful. I'd get home from work, fix myself dinner, and then sink into the couch to unwind. The walls were thin and I could hear muffled conversations and footsteps from the neighbors, but it was nothing unusual. It's a part of apartment life, right? The hum of another person's world blending with your own, the soft shifting of footsteps through walls. The first disturbance came one evening when I had just settled down with a movie. I was halfway through a scene when I heard it, a heavy thud followed by another. It wasn't a bang or a knock, but more of a weighted step, like something heavy was being dragged across the floor above me. It was slow, deliberate, almost rhythmic. I glanced at the ceiling and paused the movie. It sounded like someone was packing slowly, the weight of each footstep carrying down through the thin plaster. The sound was unmistakable, like something or someone was moving above me, but there was no one else on my floor. The apartments were all rented, but the top floor was vacant. I sat there staring at the ceiling, unsure of what to make of it. It could have been the pipes. Maybe the old building had some quirks in the plumbing that caused noises like that, right? Still, it didn't sound like pipes. It sounded like deliberate footsteps, the kind that don't belong to just any old floorboard. But I shrugged it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. It was late and I was tired. I resumed the movie and tried to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping over me. But that was the start of it. The footsteps became a nightly occurrence. Each night it was the same. At some point when the house had fallen into that deep, quiet stillness, I'd hear them, slow, deliberate steps above me, heavy and unhurried. Sometimes they'd stop, then start again as if someone was simply walking in place, considering the space. The rhythm never changed. The steps were always heavy, always grounded, and always slow, like they were intentionally making their presence known. But there was no one on the floor above me. I had checked. No one had moved in. I wondered if it was the heating system again, some old pipe clanging or expanding. It seemed to make sense. But the more it happened, the more I began to doubt that explanation. One evening, I was getting ready for bed when I heard the footsteps again, but this time they were different. They were louder, closer, heavier, like something or someone was packing just above my head. I froze, still as the apartment around me. I knew the building was old, but this felt different. There was a weight to the sound, a feeling that I couldn't shake. The footsteps weren't just walking anymore. They were moving toward me, no longer confined to the far corner of the apartment, but slowly making their way across the ceiling, getting closer, with each thud louder than the last. It was as if something was moving just above me in slow, deliberate steps, like it was coming for me. My heart began to race. I got up slowly, my feet heavy on the carpet, my mind racing with questions. Was there someone up there? How could anyone be making that much noise and not be seen? I hesitated for a moment, then walked to the door. The hallway light was dim and I could barely make out the stairs that led up to the top floor. I didn't know what I was hopping to see. Maybe I expected to find a leaky pipe or the remnants of some construction equipment left behind, but there was nothing. The building was silent now. The footsteps had stopped, leaving me alone with the echoes of my own breathing. I returned to my apartment, locking the door behind me. I felt foolish. There was no reason to be scared. It was just an old building, right? Nothing was up there. But the next few nights, the footsteps returned, as regular as ever. They were louder, heavier, and seemed to get closer each time. It was as though whatever was up there wanted me to hear it. I started to wonder if I was losing my mind. Was I just hearing things? I thought I was imagining the weight of each step, but I couldn't ignore the dread creeping in each time I heard them. The sound had a certain quality to it now, a palpable, growing tension that wrapped around me, heavy and suffocating. One night I finally decided I'd had enough. I needed to confront whatever was causing the noise. I couldn't take the creeping unease anymore. So I grabbed a broomstick, convinced myself it was a pipe or some animal up there, and I climbed up to the attic hatch. The wooden steps creaked under my weight as I slowly ascended, the silence above me thick with waiting. I turned the knob of the attic door and opened it. The room was dark, filled with forgotten boxes and old furniture covered in dust. There was no one up there, no animal, no person, nothing. The attic was empty. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the dust-filled air, trying to make sense of it all. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, something had been walking just above me every night. My heart raced as I climbed back down and locked the hatch. I realized then that it wasn't the building making the noise. It wasn't pipes or an animal or a creaky floorboard. Whatever had been walking above me was something else, something unseen, something that made its presence known, but only when I was alone. I don't live in that apartment anymore. I moved out a few weeks after that night, unable to shake the feeling of something always just above me, watching, waiting. The footsteps still echo in my mind, a reminder that some things can't be explained away. And sometimes, even when there's no one there, you can still hear their presence, heavy and deliberate, just beyond reach. I had always loved the idea of living in an old house, the kind with creaky floors and a history buried in every brick. When I found the small cottage on the outskirts of town, it felt like a dream. It was one of those homes that had been built decades ago, tucked away under a thick canopy of trees. The walls were lined with old wood, and the air had a cool, earthy smell that reminded me of places untouched by time. The neighbors were far enough away that the silence was a blessing, and when I stepped inside, everything felt so still, almost peaceful in a way that I didn't expect. It was the kind of place where every creak and groan of the house felt like a natural part of its charm. The first few weeks were perfect. I spent my evenings unpacking, settling into the quiet routine of being alone in the house. The floorboards groaned beneath my feet and the wind howled softly through the cracks in the windows at night. There were sounds, of course, the occasional hum of the fridge or the rattle of pipes, but nothing unusual. The house felt solid, like it had weathered the years well. It wasn't until the fourth week that I began to hear it. At first, it was faint, almost unnoticeable. I remember sitting in the living room one evening when I heard what sounded like something shifting above me. The noise was so soft at first that I thought it was just the house settling. But then it came again, a light scraping sound, almost like someone dragging something across the roof. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make me pause. I glanced at the ceiling, trying to place the noise. It wasn't the wind, there were no storms, no gusts of wind that would explain it. I thought it might be an animal, maybe a squirrel or a raccoon, scurrying across the roof, so I pushed it out of my mind. But the noise didn't go away. The next night it came again. This time it was a little louder, a little more distinct. I was lying in bed, just drifting off to sleep when I heard it again. A light scraping sound followed by what sounded like slow, deliberate footsteps. They weren't heavy, but they were there, soft, measured steps, like someone was walking slowly above me. It didn't make sense. I lay there, holding my breath, listening carefully. The steps continued for a minute, maybe two, before they stopped. The next day, I decided to check the roof. I didn't know why, but the thought of something moving up there, something I couldn't see, bothered me more than I cared to admit. I grabbed a ladder from the shed and climbed up to inspect. I checked every inch of the roof, looking for loose shingles or signs of damage, but there was nothing, no holes, no animals. The roof was solid as it had always been. Still, the sound kept coming back. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the house. But every night the scraping and the footsteps returned. Always at the same time, always in the same place, right above my bedroom. The sounds were so distinct, so deliberate, that I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was walking up there. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night, hearing the footsteps echoing through the roof, and I'd lie there in the dark, frozen, waiting for them to stop. But they never did. I spent days trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. Maybe it was the house, the way old wood and metal could shift and creak. but it didn't explain the footsteps. It didn't explain how the sound seemed to follow me, moving from one part of the roof to another, like something packing back and forth above me. It wasn't until one night that the sound changed. That night, the noise was different. It wasn't the soft scraping or the slow, measured steps. This time it was heavier, thudding. It was as though something large was walking across the roof, making each step deliberately loud. The noise rattled through the ceiling, and I could feel the vibrations in the walls. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The thudding continued, each step sounding heavier than the last, like someone was marching on the roof. My breath caught in my chest, and I stood up slowly, almost afraid to move, as if making too much noise would invite whatever it was to come inside. I walked toward the window, my pulse quickening, and looked out at the roof, half expecting to see someone up there just standing in the moonlight, but there was nothing. The roof was empty. The thudding stopped as soon as I stepped away from the window, like it had been waiting for me to check. For the rest of the night, the house was still again. I climbed back into bed, my mind racing, but I didn't hear a thing for the rest of the night. The next few nights were the same. The noises continued, always when I was alone, always just above my head. I started to feel paranoid, unable to focus on anything for long, always waiting for the next thud or scrape. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the house, that something was there with me, not just above but everywhere. The house felt like it was alive, breathing with me, echoing my every step. The fear became suffocating, but I couldn't leave. It felt like the house was holding me there, like whatever was on the roof didn't want me to leave. Then one night everything changed. I woke up to the sound of footsteps, but this time they were right above me, so close that the vibrations shook the walls. The sound was louder, like something was standing directly above my bed. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I slowly got out of bed, my legs trembling beneath me. I crept toward the door, desperate to get out, but when I reached for the knob, the door wouldn't open. It was as if something was pushing against it from the other side, holding me in. My heart pounded as I yanked on the door, but it wouldn't budge. The footsteps on the roof grew louder. In that moment, I understood. The house wasn't just creaking, it wasn't just shifting. Whatever was walking on the roof wasn't coming from outside, it was already inside. I could hear it, feel it in the walls, in the floorboards, in the space between each breath. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, until the sound finally stopped. And just like that, the silence returned. But I knew something had changed. The fear didn't go away. It settled deeper, like the house had absorbed it and was holding it in the walls. I moved out soon after that night. I didn't even pack everything. I left most of my things behind, too scared to stay another night. But even now, when the wind picks up or the house settles, I still hear the footsteps. In the quiet of the night, I can hear them just above me, packing back and forth. The roof is silent, but the fear remains. Something is still walking in that house, and I wonder if it ever really left. It was one of those quiet, nondescript nights that somehow stands out only in hindsight. The kind where everything feels normal at first, until something so small shifts that you can't help but look back and wonder if you should have noticed it sooner. I had just moved into the house a few weeks before, an old Victorian-style home on the edge of town. It was one of those houses with charm, the kind with wooden floors that creaked when you walked across them and windows that didn't always close all the way. But it was perfect for me, quiet, secluded, and far enough away from the noise of the city. I spent the first few days unpacking, getting used to the place and reveling in the solitude. The house felt empty at first, but there was a certain comfort to that, the kind of peace you can only find in a space that's truly yours. Everything felt normal for the most part, but there was something about the attic that always caught my attention. The door was at the far end of the hall, tucked behind a small, narrow staircase that led up to the third floor. The attic itself was dark, dusty, and full of old furniture covered in sheets. I hadn't spent much time up there, just glancing around when I moved in, making sure there was nothing too old or broken. It felt like a forgotten space, just part of the house's charm. I could hear the occasional creak from above, but nothing unusual. The house was old after all. Old houses make noise. Then one evening, about a week after I moved in, I began hearing something that I hadn't heard before. At first, it was small, almost too faint to catch. I was sitting in the living room reading, the soft flicker of the lamp lighting the space around me. I heard a sound coming from above, not a creak, not a shift like the house settling. This was different. It was a light step, slow, deliberate, like someone walking across the attic floor. At first, I told myself it was the wind, maybe something loose up there had shifted. Or perhaps an animal had found its way in, which seemed unlikely but still possible. The house wasn't exactly new. Well, but the footsteps continued the next night, and the night after that. I began to pay attention to them, not because I was afraid, but because the repetition of it was odd. The steps were slow, measured. It wasn't an animal running or even the sound of someone moving around in a hurry. It was someone or something walking deliberately, the sound faint but persistent, like someone packing in the attic above me. I checked the attic a few times, but each time the space was empty. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was the wind moving things around or some piece of furniture settling. But no matter how many times I checked, the sound kept coming back. It wasn't until one evening when I was sitting in the kitchen that I heard something different. The footsteps, always slow and measured before, were now moving faster. It was as though someone was packing around in a hurry, their steps quicker, more erratic, and louder than before. A chill ran down my spine and I stood up, feeling the weight of an unexplained fear settle over me. This wasn't normal. I walked to the base of the attic stairs, my hand hovering over the door. The sound stopped. The silence followed, hanging in the air like a thick fog. I waited. Nothing, not even the creaks of the old house. I didn't go up to the attic that night. I don't know why. Part of me felt like I shouldn't, like I was waiting for something. The next evening, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps again. They were louder now, not just walking, but packing back and forth across the attic. I lay still for a moment, listening carefully. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my body tensed as if bracing for something. The sound had a rhythm to it now, like someone was trapped up there, walking in circles. The air in the room felt thick, like it was pressing against me. I didn't know why, but I felt like I couldn't breathe. I needed to know what was causing it. I went to the attic door again, this time determined to find out what was making that sound. I reached for the handle and slowly turned it. The door creaked open and I stood at the base of the stairs for a moment, listening. The footsteps had stopped, but the air around me felt colder. The house, once warm and comforting, now felt like a stranger. I climbed the stairs slowly, my breath shallow in the cold air. Each step seemed to echo louder than the last, but I couldn't turn back. When I reached the top, I stood there for a few moments, trying to make sense of what was happening. The attic was dark, the only light coming from the small window at the far end, which barely let in any moonlight. I walked in cautiously, my eyes scanning the space. Old furniture, forgotten boxes, and dusty sheets covered everything, but the floor was undisturbed. There was no sign of anyone up there. The packing had stopped completely, and for a moment the silence in the room was deafening. As I checked behind the old furniture, under the boxes, even the small crawl space in the corner, but I found nothing. No person, no animal, just dust and old, forgotten things. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. It was a small piece of cloth stuck in the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light. I bent down to pick it up, and that's when I felt it. Well, the distinct sensation of being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a coldness press in on me. It was subtle, but it was enough to make my stomach tighten. I stood there for a moment, trying to shake off the feeling before quickly making my way back to the stairs. I don't know why, but something about the space felt different. The air felt thicker, heavier, like it was pressing down on me. I spent the rest of the night in my room trying to shake the unsettling feeling, but the footsteps never stopped. Every night they continued, sometimes louder than before, other times quieter, but always there. I began to feel like I wasn't alone in the house. Even when I left the attic door closed, the feeling of being watched lingered. It was as if whatever was up there was waiting for me to return, watching from the shadows, waiting to see what I would do next. I eventually moved out of the house. I couldn't explain the noises, the feeling of something in the attic, but I couldn't stay there any longer. Even now, whenever I'm in an old house or hear footsteps overhead, the fear rushes back, as real and as sharp as it was that first night. And sometimes, when I lie awake in bed, I still hear the faint sound of footsteps above me, slow and deliberate, packing back and forth, waiting. When I first moved into the apartment, it felt like the kind of place I had always imagined myself in, quiet, tucked away, and small enough that it never felt overwhelming. The building was old, but not in a way that felt decaying. It had character. The floors creaked in places, the windows rattled when the wind picked up, and the radiator let out an occasional sigh, but nothing unusual. I had the top floor all to myself, which I loved. The apartment felt like a refuge, far away from the noise of the city below. I could retreat into my little corner of the world and forget about everything outside. The first few days were peaceful, too peaceful even. The hum of the fridge, the rhythmic sound of traffic far below, they all became a comforting soundtrack to my routine. But there was one thing I started noticing almost immediately, something I couldn't shake. At first, it was subtle, barely perceptible, the sound of footsteps. At night, when everything else was quiet, I would lie in bed, listening to the usual creaks of the building settling, the faint hum of the neighbor's TV through the thin walls. But then I began hearing it, a soft sound, like someone walking slowly across the floor above me. The steps weren't loud. They weren't fast. They were slow, deliberate, as though someone was packing one step after another. At first, I thought it was just the old building. Maybe it was the plumbing. Maybe the pipes made noises when the water was running. But no matter how many times I told myself that, I couldn't escape the feeling that there was something off. The first time I heard the footsteps, I was sure it was just my imagination. It was a late evening, the kind where the room feels cold from the fading daylight. I had been reading in bed when I first noticed the noise. At first, it was so soft that I almost missed it, the sound of someone walking across the floor directly above me. I glanced at the ceiling, half expecting to see dust falling from the old beams. But there was nothing, just that slow, measured step. I tried to convince myself it was the wind or maybe a neighbor moving around. But the steps continued. Not fast, not chaotic, just a steady rhythm, like something was methodically walking across the floor, one step at a time. I lay there for a while listening, my heart starting to beat a little faster. The sound didn't change. It was steady, almost hypnotic, and it didn't sound like it was going away. It was as if someone was taking their time, walking back and forth above me, deliberately packing the space. The longer I listened, the more my mind raced. What could it be? It couldn't be the building, could it? The air in the room felt heavier, thicker, as though the sound itself was pulling the space around me tighter. The footsteps didn't sound right. It wasn't the usual creaks of a settling house or the pipes expanding. There was something intentional about it. By the next day, I convinced myself that I had imagined it. I was tired from moving in and adjusting to a new place. Maybe I had been hearing things, but that night it happened again. The footsteps, slow and measured, packing across the ceiling above me. I couldn't deny it this time. It was too real, too consistent. There was no way I was just imagining it. I got out of bed, stood quietly, and listened. The sound was unmistakable, now clearer, sharper, one step after another. My pulse quickened. The sound wasn't random. It wasn't just someone walking or a noise from the building. It felt deliberate. I knew there was no one up there. I had checked the apartment above mine before I moved in. There was no one living there. I decided to investigate the next day. I climbed the narrow staircase that led to the attic, hoping that whatever was causing the sound might be coming from there, maybe rats or some kind of animal that had found its way inside. The attic door was small and creaked as I opened it, the air thick and musty with age. I scanned the space, walking slowly, careful not to bump into anything. But there was nothing there, just empty boxes and dust, no signs of life, no evidence of any creatures. I stood there for a few minutes, listening, half expecting to hear the footsteps again, but the attic was silent. I breathed a sigh of relief, closed the door, and went back downstairs, convinced that whatever it wasn't here. That night the footsteps returned, but this time they were different. They weren't the slow, deliberate steps I had heard before. They were faster, more frantic, like someone was moving quickly across the floor above me, packing in hurried circles. It was as if whatever had been walking calmly before was now agitated, moving with a sense of urgency. I froze in bed, my heart pounding. The footsteps continued, each step louder and more erratic. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was hearing things because I was tired, but deep down I knew this was real. I could feel it, the weight of the steps above me, the tension in the air like something was building. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and called the landlord. When I explained the noise I was hearing, he dismissed it as normal settling sounds in an old building. But something in his voice felt off, like he was trying to downplay it, as if he knew more than he was letting on. He offered to send someone to check the building, but I didn't feel like waiting. I couldn't stay there anymore. Hearing those footsteps, I had to leave. I didn't know what was happening, but I could feel the fear growing inside me, like the walls of the apartment were closing in. I moved out that week, never going back to the apartment again. I found a new place, one that felt completely different, quiet in a way that didn't make me feel trapped. I never spoke to the landlord again. But every so often, when the wind picks up at night or when I'm lying in bed, I hear it again, those slow, deliberate steps just out of reach. And I wonder if whatever was packing above me ever really left. Because sometimes, in the quietest moments, I can still hear it. Just faintly, the sound of someone walking back and forth, waiting. I had just moved into a quiet neighborhood, the kind where the houses are spaced far enough apart that you feel like you have a little privacy, but close enough that you're never really alone. It was the perfect place to escape the noise of the city, where the air smelled like fresh-cut grass and the only sounds at night were crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. The house I moved into wasn't new, but it had character, creaky floors, high ceilings, and a small backyard that looked out onto a row of quiet houses. It felt like home the moment I stepped inside, and I quickly settled into a routine. The days were spent unpacking and exploring the town, while the nights were for reading or watching the occasional show on the couch. But there was something about the house next door that I couldn't shake. I never saw the people who lived there, but I knew they were there. The house was older than most of the others on the block, with a weathered roof that looked like it had been patched up more times than anyone could count. I never thought much of it until one evening, a few weeks after I moved in, when I noticed something strange while sitting in my living room. The light was fading outside, the sky a muted purple as the sun set, and I was half distracted by the soft hum of the refrigerator when I heard it. It started as a faint noise, barely audible, like a thud on the roof of the house next door. I paused, trying to identify what it was. At first, I thought it might have been a bird or a branch falling, something natural that came with the changing seasons. But then it happened again. A thud followed by another, then silence. It didn't sound like a tree branch or an animal. It sounded more deliberate, like something heavy was being moved across the roof. I shook my head, dismissing the thought. It was probably the wind or something else simple. But that night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again, thud, thud, thud. It wasn't the sound of the house settling, it was something moving, packing slowly across the roof next door. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was nothing to be concerned about. Houses make noises, old houses even more so, but something about the rhythm of it stuck with me. It wasn't random, it was too deliberate, too slow. The next evening, I was outside in my backyard, trying to relax after a long day when I heard the thuds again. This time I stood still and listened, my breath catching slightly as the noise continued. It was unmistakable, the sound of something walking across the roof of the house next door, each step spaced out with an eerie precision. I glanced over the fence, my eyes moving toward the weathered roof, but I saw nothing. No one was on it, no animal, no sign of movement. The roof was still and silent, but the sound continued, as if it were coming from somewhere just out of sight. I tried to push it out of my mind, but the thuds persisted, night after night. They always started around the same time, just after sunset, when the house was quiet and everything else seemed still. Each time I'd hear those slow, deliberate steps above me, moving back and forth as if someone were walking around the roof just out of view. I started to wonder if it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but then I realized something else. The sound was never random. It was always in the same place on the roof, always the same rhythm. I began to feel like I wasn't imagining it at all. Something or someone was up there. One evening, I decided to confront it. I'd had enough of hearing those steps in the dark, feeling the weight of them pressing down on the roof above me and not knowing what was causing them. I walked over to the neighbor's yard, my steps slow and deliberate. As I approached the side of the house, I noticed that the roof line was covered with moss and overgrown vines. It looked like it hadn't been properly maintained in years. The roof itself sagged slightly in places, as though it had been subjected to more wear and tear than the house could handle. I paused, listening intently for the sound that had been keeping me awake for so long. And then, there it was, that same rhythm of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the roof. I stepped closer to the side of the house, my eyes scanning the roof for any sign of life. But there was nothing. No one, no movement, just the sound of those deliberate footsteps echoing through the quiet evening. I stood there for a long time, listening, waiting for something to change. But the noise didn't stop. It continued back and forth, as if whatever it was up there had no intention of stopping. That was when I felt it, the strange sensation of being watched. It wasn't a physical feeling, not like someone standing right behind me, but more like a presence lingering just out of sight. I turned quickly, my heart racing, but there was no one around. The air felt colder suddenly, as though something had shifted. I took a deep breath and stepped back from the house, deciding to leave. But the footsteps didn't stop. They continued, growing louder as I moved away, as though following me, getting closer with each step I took. The next day, I tried to shake off the feeling. I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or some other creature moving across the roof at night. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The rhythm of the footsteps, the way they seemed too deliberate, too human, made it impossible to ignore. There was something about it that felt wrong, like I was hearing something I wasn't supposed to. Days passed and the footsteps continued. I avoided going outside in the evenings, too afraid to hear them again, but the noise followed me. It lingered in my mind like a faint echo I couldn't escape. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was walking across that roof wasn't something I could explain away. It wasn't just the sound of an animal or the house settling. It was something else, something that didn't belong. Then one evening, I was in my kitchen when I heard it again. This time it was different. The footsteps weren't slow anymore. They were quick, erratic, like someone was running across the roof, their steps heavy and fast. I rushed to the window, my heart pounding in my chest, and peered out into the dimming light. The roof was still, empty, no sign of movement, nothing, but the footsteps didn't stop. They continued, louder now, as though whatever was up there was getting closer. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. There was no more packing, no more footsteps. The silence that followed was suffocating, as though something had finally decided to leave. I stood by the window, staring out at the quiet roof, but I didn't feel relieved. I felt unsettled, like whatever had been up there wasn't done yet. So I don't live in that house anymore. After that night, I packed up and left, too unnerved to stay. I didn't know what it was that had been walking on the roof, and I never wanted to find out. The building has new tenants now, and every time I pass by, I can't help but glance at the roof, wondering if the footsteps will return. I never heard them again, but there's something about that silence, the way it followed me, that keeps me awake at night sometimes. I still wonder who or what was walking above me all those nights, and I wonder if it's still there, waiting for someone else to listen. It had been a long week. Work had drained me, and by the time Friday evening rolled around, I was more than ready to escape into the quiet of my small apartment. The rain had started falling softly as I pulled into the parking lot, the kind of rain that makes the world feel smaller, more intimate. Everything felt muted under the dark clouds, and as I parked, the soft sound of the rain hitting the roof of my car was the only thing that filled the silence. It was the kind of night that invites you to settle in, put on a movie, maybe have a cup of tea, quiet and unremarkable. I grabbed my bag, stepped out of the car, and pulled my coat tighter around me as I headed toward the building. The apartment complex was small, only a few units in a quiet corner of the city. It wasn't a glamorous place by any means, but it was home. The hallway smelled faintly of old wood and cleaning supplies, a scent I had grown used to over the last few months. The faint buzzing of the lights overhead was the only sound as I walked to my door, unlocking it and stepping inside. The apartment was just as I had left it, empty and still, with the soft hum of the refrigerator and the rain gently tapping against the windows. It was the perfect setting for a quiet evening alone. I kicked off my shoes, hung up my coat, and settled onto the couch, letting the silence envelop me. For the first hour or so, everything was normal. I had put on a movie, something light and easy to help me unwind, but my mind kept drifting. I couldn't help but notice how still everything felt, how the rain outside created a thick layer of quiet. There was something about it that made the world feel distant, as if the noise of the outside had been sealed off, leaving only this calm, empty space. The only sound was the occasional rattle of the windows, the rain beating steadily against the glass. Then I heard it. The sound so subtle I almost missed it, the faintest creak. It came from somewhere outside my apartment, from the direction of the staircase that led to the second floor. It was small, almost imperceptible, like a footstep on an old wooden floor followed by the soft shift of weight. I paused the movie, holding my breath for a moment, trying to discern what it was. The apartment was quiet, almost too quiet. There was no one on the floor above me. I was the only tenant in the building on the second floor. I had checked when I moved in, and yet the noise was undeniable. It wasn't the wind or the rain, it was the sound of someone walking. I told myself it was nothing, probably just the building settling. The walls were old after all, and the floors creaked in places. But the sound came again, this time more pronounced, a slow, deliberate step. My heart skipped a beat as I sat up straighter on the couch. I couldn't explain it, but a part of me felt observed. It wasn't just the noise, it was the timing of it, the way it seemed to be deliberately spaced, like someone was packing outside my door. The tension in the air grew as I sat there, still listening. I heard the footstep again, then another, soft but deliberate, almost measured. It was so faint, but it was there in the quiet of the apartment. My stomach tightened as I glanced toward the door, half expecting someone to be standing just outside, but there was nothing. No knock, no sound of footsteps approaching the door, just the steady rhythm of those footsteps continuing their slow, purposeful pace along the hallway outside. I couldn't help myself, I had to check. Slowly, I stood up from the couch, my footsteps muffled on the carpet as I walked toward the door. The noise had stopped, or had it? I paused at the door, listening. Nothing. The apartment was still again, the quiet almost suffocating. But the unease in my chest didn't go away. Something about the rhythm of those footsteps felt wrong, like they weren't meant to be there. I opened the door just a crack and peered into the hallway. It was empty, dark. The only light came from the dim overhead bulb that flickered occasionally. The stairs were just out of sight around the corner, and the hallway stretched in both directions, silent. There was no one there, no sign of anyone, nothing to explain the footsteps. I closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, my mind racing. Maybe it had been the wind, or maybe it was just my imagination. But as I stood there in the silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the noise, it was the way the air felt, too still, like it was waiting for something. I turned off the lights and went back to the couch, trying to settle back into the movie, but the unease lingered. Well, the footsteps didn't stop. They returned about an hour later, and this time they were louder, more distinct. There was no mistaking it now. Someone or something was moving just outside my apartment, packing the hallway again as if waiting. I could hear each step clearly now, heavy and deliberate. The rain had stopped, and the stillness of the night was replaced by the thudding of those footsteps, one after another, coming closer. It wasn't just above me, it was right outside my door. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood up again, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know. I stepped toward the door once more, but this time I hesitated. My hand hovered over the knob, the fear creeping in as I listened to the footsteps moving closer. And then, just as I was about to open it, they stopped. Silence. I waited for what felt like an eternity, my breath shallow and quick. Still nothing moved. The silence was deafening. I reached for the door and slowly turned the handle, but before I could open it, I heard something else. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like something was gently brushing against the floor, as though it had been waiting for me to open the door. I pulled my hand back. The door didn't open that night. I didn't move from the spot, standing frozen in the dark, too afraid to make a sound, afraid that whatever was outside my door was waiting for me to give in to the fear. And as the minutes passed, the footsteps didn't return. The silence remained thick and heavy. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, the quiet of the apartment pressing in on me. The footsteps never came back, but that feeling, that pressure, that quiet sense of being watched stayed with me long after the night ended. When I moved out a week later, I never told anyone what had happened. Maybe it was just a trick of the mind. Maybe it was the building settling. But when I left the fear behind, hoping it would stay where it belonged, in the stillness of that apartment. And even now, when I hear the faintest sound of footsteps in the rain, I remember that night. And I wonder if I was ever truly alone. The night holds its own kind of mystery, doesn't it? We move through our lives trusting in the quiet, the stillness of the dark hours, not realizing how easily that quiet can become something else, something watching, waiting. It's strange, isn't it, how fear isn't always loud or overwhelming. Sometimes it's just a slow, rhythmic sound that you can't quite place, something small and deliberate, lingering at the edge of your awareness. The kind of sound that makes you question what you know, even about the most familiar places. You might have found yourself listening more closely tonight, perhaps even glancing at the spaces around you, noticing how the silence feels different when you're not sure you're alone. It's that feeling, the quiet unease that stays with you long after the story's end. We've all had those moments where we hear something out of place and wonder whether it's our imagination or something else entirely. Those moments are universal, shared by anyone who's ever felt the weight of the night press in a little too close. As you settle in tonight, remember the quiet is never truly empty. Maybe it's nothing, maybe it's something. But sometimes just knowing that you're not the only one hearing the footsteps makes it easier to sleep. And if you'd like more stories, more quiet mysteries to unravel in the dark, you can always return. There's no need to explain, only to listen, to embrace the quiet until it speaks again. Sleep well, but listen closely. The night is full of whispers, and sometimes they're closer than you think.